This will be the final video regarding the Chapter 9 presentation for class, and we're going to talk about the spinal cord as very briefly about reflexes. To review for you, the spinal cord is part of the central nervous system, and it does extend down from the brainstem through the vertebral column, and in the mature adult it ends about mid-back, and then extending from it will be the spinal nerves, part of the peripheral nervous system. But if you look in this image to the far right side, you can see the green, the purple, the green, the blue, and the pink. That's the spinal cord. You notice how it ends about mid-back, around between the thoracic and the lumbar area of the body. And the spinal nerves do then extend out to the rest of the body. If you look at the spinal cord, it too is composed of both gray and white matter, just like the brain. So we have both types of cells in the body, or in the spinal cord. If we were to look at how the spinal cord is built, we looked at the spinal cord using some models in lab, but it didn't include the vertebral column. So this is a nice image looking at a cross-section of the vertebrae in the spinal cord, and we can see how well protected it is by the vertebral, right by the vertebral column, and then also the dura mater, arachnoid matter, and the pia mater, like you'll study in anatomy. There's also epidural, connective tissue, and the course of spinal fluid is traveling through and around the spinal cord. So the spinal cord itself is located here in the middle of the spinal cord. So I'm going to highlight here this whole area, which I just tried to encircle, is the spinal cord itself, part of the central nervous system. What we'll finalize and review is that we have sensory afferent nerves that enter over here, and then we also have motor efferent nerves that conduct away from the spinal cord. Okay, so right now we're just going to focus strictly on the spinal cord itself. And so what it does is physically, anatomically, functionally connect the brain to the rest of the body, and it coordinates something else that we'll study, which is called the spinal reflex. This text is a little bit confusing, but I'll leave it because it does align with your handout. But I'll talk about this and I'll go back to the image so that it hopefully makes a little bit better sense. But if we look at the spinal cord, there is gray matter, and the gray matter is the internal portion of the spinal cord. It is surrounded with white matter on the outside. And in the gray matter, you're actually going to find collectively the entire cell of your interneurons. Okay, so this says soma, or your dendrites, and the interneuron. So the entire interneuron itself is found in the gray matter. Okay, and of course it's accessory, right, glial cells. On the back end, or the posterior, the dorsal side of the spinal cord, the interneurons will communicate with afferent nerves. And on the anterior, or the ventral side, or the front side of the spinal cord, your interneurons communicate with efferent, or motor neurons. And so maybe this will make better sense with the image from your lab. This is the image from your lab book, and then what that was illustrating is here in the gray matter, highlighted here. What you'll find is collectively all of the interneurons. Okay. So if you look where I'm trying to highlight, you'll see the dendrites, the cell body, and the axon terminals. So the interneurons are in there in the gray matter, and they're tiny, but they're collectively in there, is the point. Okay. If you look closer, you'll notice that also the on the posterior side, or the dorsal side of the spinal cord, are sensory afferent nerves. They extend into the gray matter, so that the axon terminals with neurotransmitter synapse at the interneurons, because the interneurons can't exit the spinal cord, so the afferent nerves actually carry information too. And then likewise, if you look really closely, you'll see that those cells that are indicated in red, the motor efferent nerves, notice where their cell bodies and their dendrites are. They are also in the gray matter. Okay, so our little efferent nerves originate in the gray matter, but the bulk of them extend out towards somewhere in the body, in the peripheral nervous system. Okay. So all that was illustrating is the interneurons are collectively in the gray matter. Afferent nerves you'll find ending on the back side, and the efferent nerves you'll find starting on the front side of the spinal cord. Okay. Figure 9.8 does a nice job at putting into perspective where those afferent and efferent nerves are coming from or going to. Afferent nerves, we'll learn in Chapter 10, associate with some type of receptor, like illustrated here in the skin, like mechanosensor or whatever. They conduct impulses in towards the central nervous system via afferent. Okay. You may also recall that on the dorsal side of the spinal cord, you'll be able to find the different ganglion. Okay, so this whole thing right here is the ganglion. That tells you that you're on the dorsal side, but we can certainly see the afferent nerve synapsing in the gray matter. What's not shown, which I would like to see, is the interneurons. So we've got little dendrites, cell body, axon terminals. So our interneurons are right in here. Integration center, right, control center right there. Little thing that I drew in red. Okay. And it communicates with different efferent nerves, which then extend out to effector organs, like in this case, muscles. The white matter in the spinal cord, the nerve fibers will be long, and they extend up and down the spinal cord and across the spinal cord. The proper term is ascending. Those nerve cells that travel up the spinal cord are ascending. Those that travel down away from the brain are considered to be descending tracts. And those fibers that extend across to allow for communication between the left and the right side of the spinal cord or body are called transverse. We also learned in lab that our spinal nerves are actually paired. Do you remember how many pair of spinal nerves there are? So, yep, 31 pair of spinal nerves on each side. Figure 9.9 illustrates for you the gray versus the white matter. The gray matter in this image is actually colored in this opaque color, and I'm going to try to isolate it. It's kind of described as like being butterfly shaped. Okay, so that's the gray matter, and then everything outside of it is considered to be white matter. And then within that white matter, we have different cells that will allow for descension or ascension. Okay, so descending tracts. Okay, so information is being conveyed down, okay, in the descending tracts, versus nerves that are traveling up via the ascending tract. So their axon terminals will be somewhere further away towards the brain. Figure 910A gives another nice image to illustrate the role of the ascending tracts. So if we're trying to, for example, carry sensory information up, so pain and touch, those afferent nerves will synapse on the posterior side of the spinal cord. Here in this image I want to highlight, you can see the transverse, okay, and then notice the ascension, okay, pathway. And then notice where the cells synapse. That's right, the thalamus. Okay, if you remember it, it conveys information to the appropriate lobe. So physical sensations would go to the parietal lobe. So ascending fibers signal towards the brain, and then conversely, descending fibers carry information down the spinal cord out towards an effector organ. Another important thing to address when we look at the spinal cord is how it integrates. It's called a spinal reflex. We won't get to talk much about different types of reflexes, but we at least need to address what's called the spinal reflex. And if you remember from your pre-lab from this week, a reflex is just a subconscious type response to some type of stimulus. And the reflexes can be either simple or acquired, where the simple reflexes are described as being unlearned, and acquired are something that you practice over time. So a simple reflex would be example how your pupils change in diameter in changing light. Okay, so they constrict in bright light and dilate in low light. Okay, that'd be a simple reflex. You don't need to think about protecting your eyes and controlling pupil dilation. Conversely, we can also acquire reflexes through practicing. So if you think about an athletic sport that you might play, so if you're the catcher on your softball team and you've gotten to where you can throw the ball a certain way without even having to think about it, okay, or to catch the ball when it's flying towards your head, right? You've acquired that reflex to catching flying softballs, but it's not something that you would have been born with, for example. Okay. And so if we look at what's involved with a reflex, we can summarize it in what's called a reflex arc, and you can check your work with your pre-lab that you would have submitted this week. First thing is, and I know there's not room in your handout, so I apologize, but if you could squeeze it in there, you need to acknowledge that there's got to be a stimulus. Okay, so the whole point of a reflex is to respond to a stimulus that's kind of implied, and that's why I didn't originally include it. As well as there's going to be a specialized receptor connected with a specialized afferent nerve pathway. Points 1 and 2 we'll cover in better detail in Chapter 10. But that afferent pathway will synapse with an integration center like an interneuron in the spinal cord, which will select the appropriate efferent pathway, which will activate the appropriate effector organ. So points 4 and 5 we'll pick up in Chapter 11. This should look really, 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 really familiar, okay, when we talked about maintenance of homeostasis. Receptor, control center, effector. The differences, we're adding a physical set of nerves between the receptor and the integration center, and then also between the integration center and the effector. Okay. I'm going to go through this list fairly quickly because hopefully it's a review too, that the receptor is where the specialized stimulus is detected. You know now the receptors may be activated due to mechanical, chemical, thermal, or what am I missing? Electrical types of stimuli, right? They will activate afferent nerves that signal towards the central nervous system. That will synapse in the integration center. If you're looking at the spinal cord, it's in the gray matter, okay, where those interneurons are. And then the interneurons will select the appropriate efferent nerve pathway. That signal out towards the effector, which we know the effector does the work to bring back homeostasis or continue some factor, right? Again, whether it be by negative or positive feedback. And so figure 9.18 does a nice job just kind of oversimplifying this, kind of this in-out type of response and re-summarizing it. So make a reference to figure 9.18. What I'd like for you to do now is to label this image on your handout. So I'm going to put the video on pause. I'm going to pause the recording, but I want you to also pause the recording and label the different components in this little reflex arc.